Vulnerability factors for sexual victimization. Parallel to the search for risk factors for the perpetration of sexual aggression, research has sought to identify factors linked to an increased likelihood of experiencing sexual victimization. For a review, see Ullman and Najdowski, 2011. We use the term vulnerability factors rather than risk factors to denote such variables to stress that they are not causal factors for the occurrence of sexual aggression, as the causal responsibility always lies with the perpetrators. Knowing what circumstances, behaviors, and personal experiences make individuals vulnerable to sexual victimization is important for informing prevention measures and early detection of individuals who may be in danger of sexual victimization. It may also help individuals to develop a realistic perception of potentially dangerous situations and behaviors and to protect themselves against sexual victimization. Table 9.2 presents variables associated with an increased vulnerability of women to sexual assault based on the international literature analyzed for the World Report on Violence and Health, Krug et al., 2002. Table 9.2, factors increasing women's vulnerability to sexual victimization. Being married or cohabiting with a partner, being young, being poor, becoming more educated and economically empowered, at least where sexual violence perpetrated by an intimate partner is concerned, having previously been raped or sexually abused, having many sexual partners, consuming alcohol or drugs, being involved in sex work. In this section, we look more closely at vulnerability factors for sexual victimization from two broad categories: behavioral patterns and biographical experiences. For both sets of variables, remarkably consistent findings have emerged across a range of studies. Among the behavioral variables, alcohol consumption in the context of sexual encounters, the ambiguous communication of sexual intentions, and a high level of sexual activity, defined by age of onset of sexual activity and number of sexual partners, were identified as vulnerability factors for sexual victimization. Among the biographical variables, the most widely studied variable increasing vulnerability to sexual victimization is a childhood history of abuse. Across a large number of studies, alcohol consumption emerged as a consistent vulnerability factor for sexual victimization. As noted earlier, it is estimated that about half of all victims of sexual assault were drinking at the time of the assault. Prospective studies that used measures of general drinking habits to predict subsequent victimization rates found that regular drinking was linked to an increased probability of experiencing sexual victimization. One explanation for this link is that alcohol impairs women's ability to process danger cues and assess risks. A comprehensive review of the evidence by Malkanian and Ham, 2018, examined the effects of alcohol intoxication on young women's risk recognition and responses in sexual assault situations within the framework of the Social Information Processing Theory, SIP, theory of aggression, Dodge, 2011. They found that alcohol intoxication affected women's response at every stage of the model. It impaired their encoding of ambiguous cues indicating risk, the interpretation of the cues as signaling risk, the clarification of goals in terms of reducing the risk, the cognitive construction of potential responses, and the selection of a protective response in terms of an increase in passive and decrease of assertive responding. A study in 10 EU countries found that general alcohol use was unrelated to the odds of sexual victimization, but drinking alcohol in sexual situations was significantly linked to a greater likelihood of experiencing sexual victimization. Crahy et al., 2015. As noted in Chapter 5, alcohol effects have both a pharmacological and a psychological component. Reflecting the psychological component, alcohol-related expectancies were found to play a role in increasing the vulnerability to victimization. Alcohol-related expectancies in relation to sexual victimization focus on the belief that alcohol will have positive effects in sexual encounters, such as relaxation, reduction of inhibitions, liquid courage, and the enhancement of sexual pleasure. The more women expect alcohol to have positive effects in a sexual encounter, the higher their risk of sexual victimization. Palmer et al. 2010 found that positive alcohol expectancies went hand in hand with lower use of protective strategies, suggesting that positive alcohol expectancies may prevent women from perceiving themselves at risk and taking precautions to mitigate the effects of intoxication. In addition, a woman's consumption of alcohol may indirectly increase the odds of victimization by contributing to men's misperception of sexual intent. A woman's friendliness is more likely to be interpreted as sexual intent when she is drinking alcohol. The ambiguous communication of sexual intentions is another factor increasing the vulnerability to sexual victimization. In particular, this is true for token resistance, saying no when you mean yes, which refers to the apparent rejection of sexual advances despite being willing to engage in sexual contacts. Mullernhard and Hollebaugh, 1988, argued that token resistance is likely to have negative consequences. It discourages honest communication, makes women appear manipulative, and encourages men to ignore women's refusals. Ambiguous messages also undermine the negotiation of consent in a sexual encounter. Bears, 2010. Several studies have shown that token resistance is widely used by women and men in sexual encounters. It has also been established that women who use ambiguous communication strategies are more likely to experience sexual victimization. In terms of sexual behavior, engaging in casual sex, such as hookups or one-night stands, has been linked to an increased vulnerability to sexual victimization. In a longitudinal study with female college students, the number of hookup partners predicted the odds of sexual victimization over time. Moreover, it was found that women who start becoming sexually active at a younger age have more sexual partners and engage in casual sex with men were found to have a higher likelihood of experiencing unwanted sexual contacts in a number of prospective studies. In these studies, a high level of sexual activity measured at the beginning of the study was significantly associated with a higher rate of unwanted sexual experiences at a later point. High levels of sexual activity make women vulnerable because they increase the likelihood of encountering sexually aggressive men. Drinking alcohol, the ambiguous communication of sexual intentions, and engaging in casual sex are part of the conceptualization of risky sexual scripts described earlier in this chapter that have been linked to higher rates of sexual victimization in several longitudinal studies. Unlike most of the research on behavioral vulnerability factors for sexual victimization that focused on women, this research included both men and women and largely found parallel patterns of associations in both gender groups. Among the biographical experiences linked to sexual victimization, childhood sexual abuse stands out as a major risk factor for subsequent re-victimization. See also Chapter 8. Across a total of 80 studies, the most recent meta-analysis found an average re-victimization rate of 47%, indicating that almost every second victim of sexual abuse in childhood experienced re-victimization at a later time. The majority of studies address the vulnerability to re-victimization in female victims of child sexual abuse, but there is limited evidence that male victims of sexual abuse also have a higher risk of sexual victimization as adolescents and adults. Research addressing the underlying mechanisms of the pathway from childhood or adolescent sexual victimization to later re-victimization has emphasized the role of alcohol and high levels of sexual activity, described earlier in this chapter as risk factors for sexual victimization. See also the discussion of Finkelhor's 1987 traumagenic dynamics model in Chapter 8. Perhaps counterintuitively, victims of childhood sexual abuse and adolescent sexual victimization have been shown to be more sexually active in terms of earlier onset of sexual activity and greater number of sexual partners across a wide range of studies. Given the link between high levels of sexual activity and sexual victimization described earlier, abuse victims' higher level of sexual activity may function as a mediator of the link between childhood sexual abuse and later re-victimization. Similarly, heavy drinking was identified as a mediating variable in a longitudinal study by Testa et al. 2010. Also in line with the traumagenics model, an indirect pathway from childhood sexual abuse to re-victimization via reduced sexual self-esteem in women was shown in a longitudinal study by Craigie and Berger 2017. An integrative framework for understanding sexual re-victimization has been offered by Knoll and Gar 2011. In their Read, React, Respond model, presented in Figure 9.2, they propose that victims of sexual abuse are vulnerable to re-victimization because of impairments in three essential areas of functioning. The first problem for victims of child sexual abuse is a failure to properly read the situation in which an assault may occur. This misreading of the situation is due to a greater propensity to engage in risky sexual behavior, a higher likelihood of alcohol or drug use, an insecure attachment style, and problems in decoding the emotional signals of others. The second phase of problematic functioning is the react stage, which refers to physiological and affective reactions in the face of imminent harm. Victims of sexual abuse were found to show physiological underarousal in response to threat, which is dysfunctional in terms of undermining effective resistance behavior. Finally, in the respond stage, which requires a behavioral reaction to the threat of sexual assault, a history of prior victimization may impede effective forms of resistance or escape. Evidence from past research supports each of the three stages, but the full model has yet to be tested within a single design. Figure 9.2, the Read, React, Respond model of sexual re-victimization. It's a flowchart. Read, recognize cues, prioritize safety. Predictors are sexual attitudes, attachment style, emotion decoding, and substance use. Read leads to react, physiological reactivity, underarousal, impaired reaction, overarousal, system overload, stress system asymmetry. Emotions, reactivity, regulation. React leads to respond. Respond, defensive resistance, escape. Predictors are fear of repercussion, knowledge of effective strategies, and substance use. With regard to the prevention of sexual victimization, two important messages emerge from the findings discussed in this section. First, evidence that behaviors such as high levels of sexual activity, alcohol consumption, and ambiguous communication strategies are associated with an increased vulnerability to victimization can be incorporated into rape awareness programs to enable women to make informed behavioral choices. Second, the evidence on re-victimization identifies victims of childhood sexual abuse as a risk group for subsequent victimization that should be specifically targeted by rape prevention programs. Unfortunately, programs that were successful for non-victimized women had little or no effect on women with a history of childhood sexual abuse or adolescent victimization. The potential and limitations of rape prevention programs will be discussed in more detail in Chapter 12. Consequences of sexual victimization. A wide range of immediate and long-term adverse effects of sexual victimization have been identified in the research literature. In the weeks and months following the assault, many victims develop the symptomatology of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Sexual assault has been identified as one of the strongest risk factors for PTSD in women, Klump 2006. In fact, The finding that women in the general population show higher rates of PTSD than men has been attributed to the higher prevalence of sexual violence in this gender group. Tolan and Foa, 2008. A comprehensive review of the mental health outcomes of sexual victimization, including almost 500 effect sizes from studies conducted between 1970 and 2014, yielded strong evidence for the impact of sexual victimization on post-traumatic stress and suicidality, as well as on other indicators of psychopathology, such as depression, disordered eating, and substance abuse. Dworkin et al., 2017. The higher level of psychopathology in victim samples was found not only in relation to non-victimized comparison groups, but also in comparison with victims of other traumatic events. The analysis showed that the effects were larger when the assault involved physical injury and the use of weapons, but no difference was found between victimization experiences where the perpetrator was a stranger versus a person known to the victim. Importantly, although more than 80% of studies were limited to female victims, comparisons showed no significant differences in the impact of sexual victimization on women and men. In addition to the effects on mental health, many studies have demonstrated an adverse impact of sexual victimization in the domain of sexual functioning and satisfaction, and recent studies suggest that PTSD and depressive symptoms may mediate the path from sexual victimization to impaired sexual satisfaction and functioning. Kelly and Gitz, 2017. Moreover, a survey of more than 20,000 women in the U.S. identified an elevated risk of a range of physical health problems. Unacknowledged rape victims, i.e. those who indicated that they had been forced by a man to have sexual intercourse but answered no to the question of whether they had ever been raped, reported more severe psychological symptoms, such as anxiety, than women who identified their experience as rape. Clements and Ogle, 2009. Another factor associated with coping problems is the tendency for victims to see the assault as their own fault, blaming it on their behavior or on characterological faults. Janoff-Bowman, 1979. Sexual assault victims' tendency to blame themselves for the assault has been linked to higher levels of PTSD, depression, and suicidality. Sigurvinsdottir, 2019. Self-blame is promoted by negative social reactions to victims who disclose an experience of sexual assault. See discussion earlier in this chapter. A meta-analytic review of the evidence on the link between social reactions and psychopathology found that negative social reactions were linked to higher levels of psychopathology in victims, whereas supportive social reactions did not seem to have a protective effect. Dworkin et al., 2019.